And they also testified to moments of difficulty in, let's say, managing, or I'll use the word, leading the protest. Even Jim Willett, this former mayor, he used this phrase, I think you were there for it. He said that leading the protest was like, quote, herding cats, indicating that, again, it was hard to have this degree of command and control that the prosecution is alleging existed on the part of the defendants.
The province of Alberta is the fourth largest province by population. Ontario, Quebec, and British Columbia are larger. But I think Alberta is outsized when it comes to political importance. It has a very strong political ambition. I think it is as important that way as Ontario, the industrial and political heartland of the country, and Quebec with its own particular ambitions. Alberta is where things start, believe it or not just the Reform Party, not just Ralph Klein and those kind of ideas, but in so many ways the NDP, the CCF. They were founded in the prairies, often in Alberta too. And so it's no surprise that on the leading edge of political movements, Alberta is front and center. Although the trucker convoy was most famous for what it did in Ottawa, it emanated from the West. And of course, there was an echo convoy down at the border between Alberta and Montana in the border village called Coutts. I was just in Alberta the other day, as you know, at the carbon tax protest west of the city of Calgary. That shows that fervid political mentality in that province. Things are always cooking out there. And so today we go down to Lethbridge, where the trial of the so-called Coutts Three is underway. And our reporter, Robert Kraychik, is on the file. He joins us live via Skype. Robert, great to see you again. Thanks very much for joining us.
Great to be with you.
You know, I've been down there at that same Lethbridge courthouse a dozen times. That's where so many of these matters are being tried because it's the closest court to that border village. Can you give us an update on the trial of the Coutts Three? I was there personally for the first day when there was jury selection. What's it been like in the week or so since then?
Well, I'll share with you the most noteworthy occurrences that I've observed. So the first is the centrality of Rebel News to this trial. And I don't just mean the fact that I'm the only one in there day to day. I've seen some other media figures, but they're not in there with any sort of meaningful consistency. But the fact that every single video, with maybe the exception of one, that's been introduced by either the defense teams or the Crown as either an evidence piece or an exhibit, has been a Rebel News produced video. Almost all of them feature the Rebel News watermark and logo. So admittedly, there's an aspect of professional chauvinism here because it's kind of fun to see that as a Rebel News guy myself. But one adjacent point to this, and I was just contemplating this morning, I realized how stunning it was, is that none of the video evidence introduced into the trial or evidentiary exhibits or just exhibits on their own that are still in dispute have been provided by the RCMP. Now, keep in mind that the RCMP had at least 4 liaisons deployed to the Coutts border blockade protest across almost its entirety. And that was 2022. This is not 100 years ago. You would think that body cams and associated microphones would be ubiquitous, particularly for this thing that was of such high political importance to the RCMP and, of course, the federal government. So again, just keep that in mind. I'm sitting there in the courtroom, and every single video, essentially, that I'm seeing demonstrated has got that Rebel News watermark there. And again, nothing being provided by the RCMP, which was there spending tons of money to investigate or to observe or to liaise, however you want to look at it.
That is very interesting, and I take a few lessons from that. One thing that's on my mind is, if it weren't for Rebel News, we wouldn't know what really happened. I think it was similar, but not quite as dramatic in Ottawa because there were some other citizen journalists on the ground there. But for most of the time in Coutts, it was just Rebel News. There was a guy from Western Standard who was there for a bit, but we were there with the cameras rolling full tilt for more than a week. So if Rebel News had not been there, the official narrative would have been the Trudeau narrative. And so I'm glad we were there. The second thing I take from your comments, Robert, is I'm skeptical because the RCMP, which was the main police force sent out to counter the Coutts protesters, is a high-tech force. They have, as you mentioned, cameras. They have hidden cameras. They have technology that ordinary people don't have access to. They have wiretaps if they want them. They have devices that can scan and hack cell phone conversations. They have their own drones. And as we've learned from Ottawa, they could liaise with the Canadian military and even get military drones, which I'm not sure is even legally appropriate. My point is, they have more technology in the mighty RCMP than Little Rebel News had in our cell phone cameras. So I am skeptical, Robert, that they have actually furnished all of their evidence. And it strikes me as implausible that they would have this massive investigation of the Coutts protest and not record anything, that it would all just be handwritten notes. I got to tell you, I just simply don't believe it.
You're reminding me of so many things. Yeah, it's absurd. So in the context of the trial, keep in mind that these officers, 2 liaison officers that were there in alternating shifts at the protest, have to rely on their memories and notes that they've written or dictated. And you cannot capture all that. It's a very fluid, complicated, long form event with all kinds of happenings and occurrences and goings on. So to not use inexpensive, conventional, modern technology to facilitate this investigation on the one part, or on the other hand, to sort of, let's say, crowd control their stated claims that they were there to maintain peaceful assembly, cannot be taken seriously. And to your point about the high levels of technology that the RCMP and the federal government more broadly have, remember, I was sent to the first week to report on this Foreign Interference Commission. Sorry, I hope the wind is busting your eardrums. And the Foreign Interference Commission had these senior so-called intelligence agency officials, head of CSIS and some others, some former RCMP guy, speaking about how they had these capabilities that you remarked on, the ability to do, as you put it, wiretaps or interception of digital communications, all sorts of really high-tech stuff. And again, the RCMP doesn't have this sort of technology. I'm with you. I'm totally skeptical that the information or the evidence, as they put it, was furnished fully, that there's a real transparent disclosure here of what they've obtained.
Okay, so we talked about the nature of the evidence, that it's mainly in the form of Rebel News videos. I find that interesting, and like you, I take some professional pride from it. I guess both sides are trying to make their case using those same videos. We were just rolling cameras. Tell me how the trial has progressed. I was there when jury selection was made, and I thought it was a very interesting process. And, you know, from what I recall, is there's a couple of people who are so young looking, they might even be in their late teens, and it goes all the way up to people who are probably in their late 60s or maybe even early 70s. It is a diversity by age and by background, but it really does feel like Southern Alberta. And I'm glad that it was a jury pool in Lethbridge, because I know that the prosecutor had talked about taking this to a different city, like Calgary, which would have given a totally different jury pool. It would have not reflected the community in Southern Alberta. So I felt good about that. How has the jury seemed attentive so far? Have the lawyers been communicating in a way that a lay person can understand? That's obviously a challenge, because lawyers use jargon, they use technical terms, occasionally they even use a Latin word. Are the lawyers conducting themselves in a manner appropriate for a lay jury?
Okay, so on the first part, the first question you asked about the reactions of the jury, you've got to forgive me. I'm sort of all consumed about taking notes, and I'm not paying particular attention to whatever body language or expressions that they may be expressing. So I can't comment on that too much. What I can say, however, is in terms of the second question, yes, the information being presented, the comments, language, remarks from all lawyers, both the Crown prosecutors and the defense counsels, is very understandable. It's very layperson friendly. There's nothing really complicated there. Any sort of legal jargon is restricted to these voir dires, where the parties involved, the lawyers and the judge, understand that they've got these legal pedigrees that allow them to understand this. So yeah, very, very accessible information. As far as how the trial's going, this is the sort of question I think you were getting towards. The the main bone of contention, or one of the primary themes of the ongoing testimony from the witnesses that have been invited thus far, and I'll indicate who they are to you. Jim Willett is the former mayor of Coutts, and he was mayor at the time of the protest. He was the first witness. And the second two witnesses are two RCMP officers that operated as liaisons, like I was saying earlier, at the protest, to liaise between the RCMP and the protesters. And the fourth one, who's in there right now, is a guy who was sort of a higher level, let's say superintendent, I think is his official title, RCMP guy who was a bit more distant, not as much on the ground. And the theme, one of the central claims of the prosecution is that the three defendants constituted the leadership of the protest, and as such had a degree of influence and control and direction over the protesters. So a lot of the questions that you're hearing from either the Crown prosecutors or the defense attorneys to the witnesses, and remember, all the witnesses thus far have been Crown witnesses, have been towards eliciting whether or not the defendants had a degree of control. And this is the most important part. I'll give you sort of the punchline. There's been a lot of testimony from all the witnesses to the decentralized nature of the protest, which in my view is at odds with the central claim from the prosecution that these three men had control and direction and influence over the protesters. I'll give you specifics. The officers testified to several factions composing the protest, and that these different factions within the protest had strong differences of opinion over issues of how to proceed with the protest, how to conduct themselves, how to negotiate with the RCMP, if at all, how to conclude the protest, if at all. And they also testified to moments of difficulty in, let's say, managing, or I'll use the word, leading the protest. Even Jim Willett, this former mayor, he used this phrase, I think you were there for it. He said that leading the protest was like, quote, herding cats, indicating that, again, it was hard to have this degree of command and control that the prosecution is alleging existed on the part of the defendants.
That's very interesting. So it's been a number of days, and like you say, it's the Crown's witnesses. So these are the witnesses that the prosecutors are bringing, thinking that they will elicit facts that will condemn the accused. How are the accused lawyers doing in cross-examination? I know two of them quite well, the lawyers, I mean. The other two, I only know from observing them briefly in court there in Lethbridge. Are they aggressive? Are there gotcha moments? How would you describe the defense lawyers? By the way, the Democracy Fund is crowdfunding all of the defense lawyers. There's 4 lawyers sitting in there. All 4 of them are being paid by crowdfunding. And by the way, I want to just say to our viewers, if you want to chip into those lawyers, go to Coutts3.com and your donation will get a charitable tax receipt. I just wanted to throw that plug in there because you see 4 lawyers. I, in my mind, say, 4 lawyers billing every hour, but this is an important fight to win. Sorry, let me put that tangent aside. How are the defense lawyers doing? What's their approach to the Crown witnesses? Are they aggressive? Are they argumentative? Are they sneaky? How does it feel? I just wish I could see it with my own eyes.
Well, first, I just want to continue with your tangent. This is money well spent. And in my estimation, I'm a layperson. What I see in these lawyers is extreme competence. As far as the demeanor, your actual question, how are they conducting themselves? They are very congenial, very professional. They're professional. They're not aggressive. They're very articulate. They're very specific. They're very deliberate and thoughtful. And to what I was saying earlier, I'll just give some examples. It was the questioning of these lawyers that elicited remarks, testimony from these witnesses. Remember, I was mentioning 2 RCMP officers who were liaisons, and this former Coutts mayor, Jim Willett. They got them to acknowledge in testimony that, again, there was a decentralized flavor, character, nature to the protest, which, again, is in central contradiction to this claim from the prosecution that there was this degree of command and control. So you wouldn't be able to elicit that testimony if not for extreme competence. But yeah, just to the basic question of the flavor, again, very congenial, professional. Very diplomatic. These guys are great. I have nothing but amazing words and praise to share for them based on my observations with them. And just one more disclosure. I don't know if this is a violation of privacy, but I've spoken to them outside the courtroom, and they're just really, really well put together guys.
I'm glad to hear it. I've been following your live tweeting from court, and I would recommend our viewers to do that because you're sort of giving updates every few minutes. One of the things I learned from your live tweeting is that at least one of the police witnesses acknowledged that they did not see the accused men block the highway, but rather they saw the accused men help unblock the highway. I thought that was such a powerful fact.
Yeah, so that's more evidence of what I was saying earlier regarding the extreme competence of these lawyers and how this is money well spent for those that were kind enough to donate to the defense fund. So the two officers, the two liaisons, their names are Mark Wilgosh and Greg Tulloch, if anybody cares about those names, testified that when it came to trying to coordinate the protest in a way that would serve the RCMP's interests, specifically they mentioned opening of lanes during intermittent periods of blockade. In other words, to allow for traffic to flow in both directions at this highway, Alberta Highway 4, that sort of heads south towards Coutts from northern Alberta, that Marco Van Hugenbos and George Jansen, two of the three defendants, were very helpful in doing that. Conversely, when one of the RCMP officers was asked, did you see the defendants coordinate a blockade or coordinate a blockage? She said, no, I did not see that. So the bottom line here is that the two officers have testified repeatedly in several dimensions to the utility that they attributed to two of the defendants, George Jansen and Michael Hugenbos, in terms of their desire to liaise with the protest, not conceding leadership, by the way, but to help assist, get the protesters to do certain things that the RCMP wanted at certain times. Further, just as far as to continue with your question about flavor and character, you were asking about the lawyers. One of the RCMP officer liaisons said that George Jansen was particularly congenial. He used the word professional, he used the word compassionate, and he used the word polite in describing his exchanges with them. And the reason I mention that is because I think the demeanor, the composure of the defendants, as was captured by the Rebel News video, by the way, all of it, is, in my view, again, I'm offering this sort of amateur legal analysis, sort of exculpatory at a minimum, because they were always advising any protesters that they may be speaking to maintain peaceable assembly, maintain peaceful demonstration, and so forth. So insofar as they had any influence whatsoever, insofar as they could communicate with their fellow protesters, they were constantly advising peaceful demonstration.
You know, that's very interesting, and I think it may be legally important. It reminds me of one of the things that has come through in the Ottawa trial of Tamara Leach, where it has come out through the trial that, far from being at odds with the RCMP, Tamara Leach and the other leaders of the Ottawa convoy had a regular back and forth to manage things, to clear this lane, to move the trucks out of this residential area to that non-residential area. And not only is that interesting that the protests were cooperative, but it suggests that there was I think a lawyer might use the word estoppel, namely that the police condoned what was going on. The police, you might even say, instructed the protest to move from here to there, instructed a truck to be here rather than there. So how could someone who was cooperating with the police, who is working with the police to facilitate certain lanes open or closed, if you're working with the police, cooperating with the police, complying with the police, even you might say obeying the police, how can that then be called mischief? And I think that that cooperative approach, and I think it was very strong in Ottawa. I know that because they had some very clear objectives: get the trucks out of the residential areas, keep a lane free for ambulances. They were very like on a daily basis and very formal basis, negotiating with the city and the police. Sounds like there's a bit of that here in the Coutts trial.
Yeah, so I think from my understanding of the Coutts trial, now I was not there. I was in Ottawa basically every day. I can remark on that with a bit more confidence based on my own experience. But the Coutts protest was, this is going to sound funny because it was so much smaller, was seemingly more decentralized, was more sort of ad hoc, informal, more chaotic perhaps. And Ottawa, eclipsing Coutts in terms of size and volume, was actually more controlled in a way. Anyway, to the point of, okay, this is so funny you mentioned this. Chris Barber is actually here today, and I'm actually going to interview him at the end of proceedings. And I was just thinking about what you were saying, this constant refrain from Chris Barber in these videos that he produced, that he recorded and published to so-called social media to advise supporters and demonstrators to maintain peaceable assembly, to compel police officers. And remember that Tamara Leach and Chris Barber are being charged with counseling others to mischief.
Right.
In other words, that they're being accused of advising others to commit mischief.
Right.
But what I saw in all of the videos was Chris Barber counseling others to comply and maintain legal assembly.
Yeah.
So like the very evidence being put forward by the Crown is at odds with their central claim that these two defendants were advising others to break the law. And the same thing is true here, by the way, in that same regard.
Isn't that interesting? Well, I tell you, I wish I was there. There's so many stories going on across the country. And thanks, by the way, for going out to that carbon tax protest on the Trans-Canada Highway on the way to Banff. I popped by there the other day just to check it out. And it has that same spirit of the Freedom Convoy. So I know you're an Ottawa boy. To have you in Alberta, I think that's good for your soul. And I think you're sort of marinating in the freedom out there. And I'm glad you're covering that. Thank you for that. There are two ways people can help. We've already mentioned the way to chip into the legal defense. That's at Coutts3.com. But as I mentioned, Robert's not actually from Lethbridge, so we put him up in an Airbnb and we rented a car and we're covering his meals and stuff while he's out there. He's staying economy class, but still it does add up because he's there for days and days and days. To chip in for his modest costs, feel free to go to truckertrial.ca. Robert, thanks very much for reporting from there, and we look forward to your updates on Twitter and in your videos.
My pleasure. I love being with you.
Right on. Thanks for your time. There you have it. Robert Kraychik, live from outside the courthouse in Lethbridge. Stay with us. More ahead.